Okay. Hey, it works. Hi, everybody. I'm Kate Gardiner. AVG is a consultancy based in New York City. We focus on working with media brands. It says that on that slide. I'm going to talk to you today about audience engagement and why that matters. Audience engagement is the new, more correct way of engaging with your consumers. You may come from a perspective where social media is the phrase that you use, but you're just talking about the technology. You're not talking about the relationships that you might have with your consumers. And when you're talking about that, you're not talking about the people. The exact nature of your communication strategy shouldn't matter. It should be focused on what people are doing, the activities that they're participating in, the movements that they've built online, the conversations that they're having. When we're thinking about consumers, we're thinking about people who are reading your social media. We are thinking about ways that they're engaging with specific storytelling, and we're thinking about the technology that they're using to do that. But what you should hopefully be thinking about is the relationships that they have with you, your brands, and the things that you make or buy. Many of you are building new companies, and those companies should really be thinking about how that consumer interface really matters. On the platforms that you're engaging on, you should be talking directly to individual users, individual storytellers, individual platform fanatics, for example, or influencers, because what you're trying to do is make sure that there's something of interest to them. But think about the way that you talk to your consumers on a daily basis. A lot of you are using Zendesk or Salesforce or things like that that are meant for a business relationship, and it takes some of the fun out of it. You might be playing with it on Slack. You might be playing with the way that you engage with your users on Twitter. You might be building GIFs. You might be doing all sorts of other things to talk to them, but you are probably more talking at them than you're talking with them, and that doesn't engender the brand loyalty that most of our users, most of our brands are going for, and most of our users prefer. We use email on a daily basis, obviously. We use the conference line. But you're focused on the social media platform. And the thing about it that's more useful is it's always incessantly a marketing opportunity. It's something that people can quote back at you. It's something that people are hyper aware of, and it's something that's going to lead to earned media over time. We have, for example, a client right now who had 4 or 5 news stories come out of just the fact that they were using social media. And in that case, that meant that she had, an extra 100,000 media impressions just because she happened to post a specific video in a specific way. And the fact that that history exists is something that allows you to become a more reliable brand in the eyes of the audience you're trying to target. But what does it matter if we redefine social media as audience engagement? Well, you already do your social media. You mechanically do that social media. You're engaging with people in a way on a platform that is talking at them. But if you redefine it as audience engagement, that means you're talking back and forth. That means you're talking with that audience. And that includes any interaction you're doing in a public way. I say GitHub on this slide. There are all sorts of things that you think of as behind the scenes. There's very, very little public-oriented information that's behind the scenes, and there's no particular reason to keep it that way. For example, you can open a Slack channel that allows your customers to engage in public, and that might be more useful for brand longevity and brand loyalty than any other means that you might be communicating with your clients. And the thing about that engagement is, in the long term, it's going to be more meaningful to have someone who is constantly talking about your product than it is to be having someone look at it on a glance. And so what I tell new startup founders that we work with is that they should be thinking about their social strategy as core and integral to the way that their business functions. This isn't common because most people are very, very focused on building their product, but it is something that you have to think of in terms of the longevity of your business as well as in the long-term value proposition that you're offering to your investors or to stockholders or to whoever you happen to have who's controlling the money. This integral nature of this communication and the way that you're thinking about structuring your company means that you've changed the way that you're thinking about consumption and pattern. Audience engagement is this endless conversation. And it's by changing the way you're thinking about it, audience engagement also means something that sort of centralizes the core messaging that your organization is pulling together. It emphasizes all of the strengths. So for example, if your organization has a weak comms department, a weak marketing department, or it has something of a weak product that you're trying to launch, unless you've got a very clever marketing strategy backing that up, social media may be the only way that you're going to be able to communicate your story and its importance to your audience. That means that the added value of social media is what your investors may or may not see. And I think that over time, the more prominent you are in social media and the more engaged your audience is, the longer term value folks are going to have for your startup. It's also a very intimate way of engaging with your consumer. The cool part about having a one-on-one conversation with a user or a passionate fan is that those people are going to constantly remember that engagement. I did a study about 6 years ago, for example, that said if we just retweeted somebody or if we acknowledged them from the main branded account, that person would likely be following the brand and engaging with the brand 3 to 6 months later. A person who just randomly engages with the brand and isn't answered is likely to actually have a negative association with that brand, and at the end of the day, they're probably going to disappear, or they're going to not have that loyalty, and that is not going to translate into revenue. And for the majority of us, revenue is either the consumption of a website, so for example, I work with all sorts of media brands, or it's actual literal dollars in the sense of a traditional product where someone is buying something. But getting beyond the platform, what you're trying to do is figure out stories that will appeal to the audience that you would like to make money from. And you kind of have to think about the messaging before you think about the place that you're going to put it. You should never say, oh, just throw that on Twitter, or throw that on Facebook, or throw that on Instagram. You should be thinking of the story you'd like to tell. And you need to think about the value add that your product, your service, your cause has to that consumer. Are you going to save their favorite thing? Are you going to sell them something that makes their life easier? Every single item that you put out in the public space should reflect that in a calm, courteous way that also leads to someone feeling like you know what you're talking about and they know what they're going to get out of an engagement with you. When I say this makes or breaks your brand, this is literally sometimes the only asset folks have at the end of a fundraising cycle that they can raise money off of. And sometimes that's really, really important to the next stage of a startup's development if the startup is going to stay in business. But you have to step back a little bit and you have to think about how that makes, how that's meaningful. What story are you telling, and in what way will that story yield value for that person you're engaging with, either in the very, very short term or in the long term. And then what does engagement mean to you? Oftentimes we think about social media in terms of a KPI that's defined by the number of users who liked or engaged with a post, but you have to step back and wonder, okay, what's the aggregate value of a social media channel in terms of our engagement? Is there a dollar number that we can assign to it? Is there a number of user interactions that we can make a goal? How do we measure success in this particular conversation? And then in the larger scale, if you have 100,000 or 1,000,000 uniques on a particular piece of social media, what does that mean in terms of the value of your company and the long-term interplay there? For a small startup, I often encourage them to highlight their best social media days and use that for fundraising in the long run. Mostly because you should be able to build a graph that's up and to the right if you've been paying attention to your social media over the course of the development of your company, no matter how small and how niche. But audience engagement also means a constant churn of engagement with individuals. So for example, I say immediate. It means that you're talking to people as soon as they talk to you. Sometimes this means it's wildly impractical. Other times it means that you have to set a core set of hours on your social media pages to kind of manage traffic flow. And other times it means that you just have to assign someone to constantly be responding to and feeding your feeds. When I say it means inside jokes, memes, and repartee, that means that you're not afraid to poke fun at yourself if it's appropriate to your brand. It means that you acknowledge that you have specific fans on your social media pages and that those fans are doing individually important things. It means that you're customizing content to the audience you're developing. You're acknowledging the fact that perhaps you have a particularly nerdy audience, or your audience is a particular fan of a sports team, or they're likely to have a specific item in common amongst them. Maybe they own an iPhone or an Android, for example. But you're aware of that, and you're programming appropriately. And when I say honesty, I think that there's a tendency to want to hide what's truly going on in an organization. And you should do that to the point that it's discretion. But I would never want you to blatantly lie to a consumer if you can get around it. And then I say it takes a lot of work. Social media is endless. An engaged audience is a happy audience, which means they're talking to you constantly. And it's really, really challenging. I mean, you can have hundreds or thousands of tweets or Facebook posts or LinkedIn, even LinkedIn requests in an individual day. And the value of ad of each individual consumer is not necessarily direct to you, but at the same time, that aggregate audience over time, especially if it's engaged, is going to yield customers, and it's going to yield brand recognition as you grow. So what's the first step for a young startup that's looking at a growth phase, who wants to succeed on social media? We tell you to spend 30% of the investment you're making on in your product on your distribution strategy, and that includes social media. So it's a basic principle of marketing. It's a traditional number, but it's really worth considering, because if you're not willing to put 30% of your money behind the idea you're backing, you should really consider what you're up to. If you are building a hardware product, for example, and you don't want to spend that much money on marketing, how are people going to know to buy it? Are you going to end up with a garage full of extras? Are you going to end up with a prototype lying around somewhere that you just have to live with for the rest of your life and recognize as a very, very expensive hood ornament or whatever? And then you really have to think about it in the context of your distribution strategy and your long-term margin. So if you have an audience right now, today, that is willing to fork over the funds, that's great, but the likelihood of that is fairly small. So if you make a 30% investment of $100,000, that's $30,000 today, but your ROI may be in excess of $10 million, depending on how you price the objects. So you really have to kind of think at scale, or at profitability, or at least sell-out rate. If you have a physical item that can sell out, what percentage of your margin are you willing to spend on the fact that you've distributed the item? Forgot that's a slide. But you have to put your money where your mouth is the basic takeaway. Like, you really, really need to think about the long-term plan you have. You're building a company. Companies don't just die. They don't just go away, and they don't market themselves. So how are you going to work with that? But that brings us to this. Literally, what do you do? I can give you a recipe. We have client recipes for specific industries. We spend a lot of time thinking about engagement and things like that. But the problem with that recipe is it's not necessarily suited to the audience that you're developing in particular. And it may not work. You also may learn that your particular audience is very different from anyone else's, and that they only like things overnight, or they only like things on Tuesdays, or they might have some other perk or characteristic that doesn't make sense. But you have to kind of live with it, and you have to go with the flow. If we come up with a clever Facebook or Instagram strategy, that's great, but it's only a part of the messaging because it is stuck on one platform, and it may or may not translate into anything off of that platform. For example, you may have 100,000 viewers on your Facebook Live videos and 10 people buy it. Is that practical in the long run? No. It does increase your notoriety, but you want to see if there isn't a better platform for conversions in that case. I bring up Snapchat. The reason that I bring up Snapchat is because influencers spend all of their time on Snapchatting, but at the same time, there's no direct ROI necessarily affiliated with the platform itself, and it's difficult to learn how to use. On the one hand, you could invest significant time and resources on that. On the other hand, you could again look for another platform or another audience group that might make more sense for you. And that comes into marketing stunts or pretty photos or any number of other things that someone might tell you to do. It is a big part of what you should be doing, but I think that you have to be very aware of the fact that there are so many different platforms that you could be engaging with, and you should be hyper aware of the fact that not everything in marketing works, and it takes a lot of time to A/B test that. But the way to get around that is to do your homework. Think about the commitment you're going to make, and then ask these, well, I started with 10 arbitrary questions, but think really hard about who you're going to talk to, why you're going to talk to them, what the goal of the engagement strategy you'd like to build out is. Is that going to be customers? Is it going to be money? Is it going to be notoriety? Is it going to be additional earned media in concert with your public relations strategy? Is it one-on-one customer service? Is it group customer service? Is it something as simple as letting people know that the site is up, down, or sideways? Is it that there's a new iteration of your game out to download, or a new Easter egg hidden somewhere on level 17? Like, what are you thinking about, and why do you want to talk to those people? And then where do you need to be online? A lot of people come to us saying, hey, I've been really, really successful on the web, but I've noticed that my audience is shifting to mobile. Well, this is a big problem if you haven't mobile optimized your site, or if you are stuck on one platform. So, for example, you designed for iOS but not Android. And we have to think about ways to mitigate that. Either we continue going hard on iOS, we come up with a plausible story for not going to Android, or we web optimize the website in a way that could yield a more successful experience without building another app. And then the next piece is identifying where you need to be online. So for example, I bring up Reddit. There's 30,000 or more subreddits. Each Reddit is subreddit is an example of an interest group. And therefore, there is an obvious way to target those users. They have opted in to being interested there. Then I would encourage people to go into that subreddit and actively participate in conversation in a way that's meaningful to those users. In the long run, that means that you know more about each individual user, and in the immediate term, that also means that you have an option to come out from behind the app and have a conversation with this group of consumers who are interested in the subject area, service, or item that you're talking about. And there's also a component of real world. Is there a point to having real world activations, either co-sponsoring them or otherwise hosting events like this one? Are you going to get something out of it? If your target is investors, yes, you could come to something like this and become better known in that world. If your goal is to facilitate conversation between members of a digital audience, then you go there and you think about the way that you could help those people get out of their homes and come to some sort of an activation. And then if you think about all of that, the important part, especially for those of us who are focused heavily on building scalable things, is there a market size that could be sustainable, and at what price point is that market size sustainable? This is something that you probably did during your business planning phase, but it's not necessarily something that's going to be as helpful as you might wish it would be, unless you've done the research beforehand. For example, if I like boxing, but there's only 10,000 people in my geographic region who like boxing, how many fans is it reasonable to have on any particular social media platform, and what platform would that be? That's the mystery that you're trying to solve for, and those things actually have some numbers you can plug into them. So you should be able to figure out what the number of audience members you have to be successful should be. I have clients, for example, who end up in second-tier cities primarily because, in the States, because there's more audience engagement in Denver than there is in New York. And it's a surprise to them, but at the same time, the economics are telling them that is where they need to be, and that's where they can serve the most need. It also changes the numbers in terms of the entire development of their business, and often leads to more success than they'd expected. And then the variability, that's sort of looking at your bell curve of consumers and trying to serve the middle 50%, middle 75%. You've got your hardcore users who are on your site every single day, and you've got that guy that signs up once. Somewhere in the middle is the person you're trying to serve, and then you have to figure out what platforms that person is on and go after them there. Organic growth of a social platform is possible, but it's unlikely unless you know all of this information. Ideally, as you've done all of this research, you've built a profile. And that includes all of this information about a specific person. You're thinking about how old they are. Are they between 18 and 35? It's going to be really expensive to target them on social platforms because everyone else wants to. Are you sure that their gender is female or male? A lot of people online are male, but the majority of buying decisions are made by women, for example. So what decisions can you change, and how do you fix that? And then political and religious perspectives really change the way that you make your advertising. They change the colors you use. They change the attire of the models you might shoot. They change the ideal influencer for you. And they change all sorts of other things. So you just kind of have to think about what makes sense from a business perspective. And then you have to think about the way that they're consuming all of that. So are they consuming their content on their phone? Should you be focused on that? Answer is probably yes. Are they older? Do they need to have larger size fonts, for example, or do they need to have super simple instructions because they have lower web competency? Or do they have some other need that you need to serve? After you've done all of this, you can kind of really figure out what the perfect social platforms are for you, and you can focus on an audience engagement strategy that has the best opportunity to work, and will be probably less frustrating than doing a sort of spaghetti on the wall method of research and execution. And then after you define this group, you can look at these crucial questions. What makes them buy? How do they pay? How do they like to ask you questions? Do they have logins to things like Zendesk and understand how they work? Or do you need to do something really simple like Facebook Messenger to communicate with your audience? Do they approach you on Twitter? What's the main audience sentiment there? And how do we turn that into something better? And then you also have to step away from your biases. A lot of us have a preferred social platform, and that's great and wonderful, but it's not necessarily the one that your audience is going to be interested in. You might prefer Instagram or Reddit, and they might prefer Facebook or Pinterest. If it isn't your area of expertise, you need to find someone whose area of expertise it is, and you need to pay them to help you. It is impractical to try to force people to use Facebook if there are people who don't believe in it, for example, or to force people to log in via Google when you know that none of them have that login. These things are unlikely, but at the same time, sometimes they happen if you are within a specific demographic or interest group. After all of this is the core of your business. You now know your consumer, you can talk to them, and you can figure out best practices for your audience. This means showing the sense of humor like I talked about before. It means developing repartee. It means developing sort of discussion points and brand identity. You can shape out who you're talking to through sort of this method and variations on this method because you mostly know who you're talking to. I come to this from journalism, which means I focus a lot on the who, what, when, where, why, and how. And we go through that exercise every single time we work with a client, and it's every single time we work with someone who'd like to be more active online, because we need to know what the point of it all is. But then you've made this person in your head, and that's your ideal consumer, and you're making all of your content appeal to that person. For example, I am not this core consumer of the Chive, but I know exactly who they're trying to talk to. I'm not the core consumer of Reddit, but I know exactly who they've been talking to for the last 10 years at least. I am the core consumer of Facebook, but I abuse their systems to a point that I'm an extreme use case, and they're not usually catering to me. And knowing that about your consumer means that you can make rapid-fire decisions about which platforms you choose to engage in and which platforms you choose to expand to. Every single time you learn a new data point about your audience, that is when you choose to make a different decision about audience engagement and whether or not you should continue being active on that platform. For example, Twitter is notoriously low in terms of engagement, and you have to kind of make a decision about whether or not you want to go through the trouble of trying to keep your Twitter alive, or if you want to use it just as a base point for communications about site services. And after you've made that choice, you can really focus your energies on something that may be more fruitful to you and your audience. But whatever you're doing, every single time you talk to somebody, you should make sure that you're doing your best work and that you're being very considered and courteous in your response, because tweets live forever, social media posts live forever, and anytime that you censor something, someone's going to notice and call you out on it. This means that the person that you're talking to is someone that you need to engage with, and you should talk about breaking news events. You should talk about things that are happening in the features. You know, if Beyonce drops a new album and that's something that you think is important to your audience, you should express an opinion about it. If something happens to the next biography of Steve Jobs that comes out, that's something that you should think about and something that you should react to. If there is something that happens at Facebook that changes the way that you have a relationship with them, that's something that's really important to your core audience and to your core consumers. But it's something that you really need to be conscious of and lively about. But at the same time, if you need to set limits, if you need to make hours, that's completely reasonable and within expectations. And the other thing that you're doing is you're thinking about actually where your person is. Is this particular thing that is happening relevant to the core audience that you're talking about? Is your server going down in Idaho because of a tornado? Be sympathetic to the people who live there as much as you are concerned about the impact it is having on your business. Is a breaking news event reflecting poorly on someone you work with frequently? Consider your response and then go out of your way to make sure that people who are talking to you are aware of your opinions on the matter or are very consciously not commenting on social platforms until things die down. There's no point at which you have to issue a statement but sometimes you must to quell a business concern, at which point you should be direct, to the point, and concise. No matter what you do, you should be thinking about the audience you're talking to is more than just a data point. It should be that they're a human being. It's that you're talking to someone who's going to engage with you on an individual level for the length of their interaction with your company. And then you want to elicit engagement and value. So you're thinking about your particular value to society as a whole, or to that particular person. And that can have a $10 value, or it can have a $100,000 value, depending on what you're selling them. But you should treat each relationship you have with that customer as invariably useful to individuals. But this is just a beginning of a conversation, because so many of us are working on social platforms that work with different news organizations and different audiences, as well as different brands and different services. It needs to be tailored to the audience that you need to serve. And I think that that's what everybody should really be considering as they continue to build their startups audience online. And the way that you engage with those individual users is to ask those core questions and develop that demographic profile in your brain before you choose the platforms to build your audience on. I'm going to take questions in a minute, as soon as Jason comes back. But if you have any questions about specifically how your startup should take advantage of an audience, I'd love to hear them. Anybody? No worries? Cool.
Hi. Every single brand has their own objectives that they want to get out through engagement. Are there any particular tools that you suggest to monitor that engagement and to keep track of how that's changing?
Every single platform, there's a really cool new one called Sonar, S-O-N-R, that's kind of awesome, but it's still in beta. It's supposed to be a universal solution. But since it's still in beta, we'll see if it works for people who have scale brands. They're trying it on mid-size brands. And it would still work for startups, at least right now. I'm not sure if it'll build out. The other one that I encourage people to use to watch their chatter is CrowdTangle, which is a US-based startup focused primarily on the way that content is being distributed across social platforms. If you're on a super limited budget, or you need to be concerned about that kind of stuff, I would really think about Buffer, which is free-ish. It's got a freemium model, or Hootsuite, though my issue with Hootsuite tends to be the way that they distribute their analytics, and also the way that they lock down user accounts. It's very challenging to have multiple logins without paying a huge amount of money.
Oh, but Hootsuite is from Vancouver.
Hootsuite is Canadian.
Which is a plus. So think about Hootsuite.
Thanks very much. That was great. Can you speak for a moment to media efforts to engage audiences in the face of the bleed of the vast majority of their audiences, which used to be on their sites and on their pages, to social media? And in particular, any thoughts on how video is playing in Facebook Live, Periscope, etc.? Thanks.
Facebook Live is corrupting the media model right now, like the traditional media model. If you are a person who's dependent on on-site advertising revenue, it is a really good time to start thinking about that subscription model, or thinking about becoming one of the 150 organizations that has a paid relationship. Broadly speaking, I'm sending a lot of clients over to email models, because that's still the last frontier where you have direct control of your consumer. But I go out of my way to say that you need to have a backup plan right now, because the majority of small to mid-sized organizations have not jumped onto social media in a way that's going to be meaningful if you're fighting against the Facebook Live bias that they've built into the algorithm at the moment. So it really depends, but when we work with specific media organizations, we've got one in mind right now. Even though they're a print organization, we're trying to figure out things that they can do that are live video, because we've lost so much of the algorithmic distribution that we used to have for print and like photo-based posting.
Email, an
Sorry.
oldie but a goodie. I love it. Anyone else? We have a few more questions.
Yes.
If people have more questions later, where can they find you?
They can find me on the internet, all sorts of different places. I'm mostly on Twitter, even though that's also got lower ROI than it used to.
And you'll engage with them there?
I am very engaged.
I figured. All right.
Constantly
A
engaged.
huge round of applause for Kate. Thank you for joining us.